The weird neighbor. Today I just learned a strange story that my own family went through. The story I tell to let everyone know that somewhere there are spiritual stories that science has no explanation for is completely true. I will tell the story from beginning to end without adding or subtracting any details. I'll get into the story right here. My family lives in the Lat. My parents are both university lecturers. In 2005, my father transferred his job to Sigon and lived here with his sister who had gone down before to study at university. During my high school years, I studied in the Lat, then moved back to Sigon to study in 2009. Even though my father and I lived in Sigon, leaving my mother alone in the Lat, the family was still very happy. Every 2 weeks, my father comes back to visit my mother, or sometimes when she has free time, she still goes to Sigon to take care of the 3 children. Mom being alone in the Lat is sometimes sad, so outside of work, she plays a lot of sports and has very good health. During the first year of Tet, I went home to celebrate Tet with my mother, and my father went back to his hometown to visit his grandmother. At that time, my older sister had gone to work and had to return on the 29th of Tet. That night, when I lay down with my mother and talked, she confided that she was sat up here alone and missed her father and her children, but luckily she also had a job, played sports, and had neighbors visit her, so it helped a lot. My mother told me that the day I moved my things back to Sigon to study, there was a lady at the other end of the neighborhood who moved in. This woman's name is Lone. She is about 40 years old but looks very old compared to my mother. Miss Lone's figure is chubby and a bit short. Her mother said she lived with her siblings but they moved to Australia to settle. She stayed in Vietnam to keep the house, did not have a job, and the other family sent money back every month. Due to her expenses, Miss Lone has a lot of free time. Miss Lone was not welcomed by the neighbors because her mother said she had some psychological problems. It is understandable that at this age, no one would be able to get married without getting married. Mrs. Lone has a nosy personality. When she sees anything new in her neighbors, she always asks about the origin, price, etc. Makes the neighbors very uncomfortable. People don't like Miss Lone. She only answers politely when asked questions and no one bothers to talk. As for my mother, she often pickles pickles and eggplants and calls Mrs. Lone over to get a jar to eat. Mrs. Lone saw that and often came over to visit. In the last days of the year, Mrs. Lone came and found it strange to see me in the house. She asked questions but I realized that her way of talking was not normal. It seemed like she had not studied much in the past. That day, my mother and I were cooking lunch in the kitchen. Mrs. Lone came to the door. My mother told me to come down because the door was unlocked. Then we both bent down to cook. Bam! Mom ran out and saw Mrs. Lone sitting at the foot of the stairs leading to the kitchen. Her face was pale, her hands and feet were shaking, her hair was messy, and her eyes looked like she had lost her soul. Mom shook Miss Lone and then asked her how she was walking and standing, so she slipped and fell. Miss Lone sat stunned for a moment before startled and stammered out, "The stairs in this house are so slippery, if you don't walk carefully, you'll fall." Then her mother helped Mrs. Lone into the kitchen and sit down on a chair. Miss Lone's face was still blank, but I stopped paying attention and continued busying myself with the iron. My mother opened her mouth to offer Mrs. Lone a bowl of rice. Mrs. Lone happily accepted but kept complaining about the stairs. In my kitchen, I placed a small round mirror with a stand. Suddenly I looked at the mirror that was standing near the kitchen. I saw Miss Lone's face. In the mirror, she looked much older and her face was very angry. However, when she saw me in the mirror, Miss Lone smirked. Her previously absent-minded expression disappeared, replaced by a look of defiance. Startled, the vegetable knife cut his hand. The scene at that moment was very terrifying. How could the person in the mirror be so different from the outside appearance? I rushed up to the house to stop my bleeding finger and then went downstairs to be with my mother. Mrs. Lone came home. Her mother said she fell in pain, so she left to apply medicine and changed her mind about refusing the meal. The mirror from earlier had been placed face down by someone. That was the first strange thing I saw in my life. It haunted me for several evenings, and almost every time I brushed my teeth and looked in the mirror, I thought of Mrs. Lone's ghostly face. That year was on the third Mrs. Lone came over to visit, but for some reason she refused to come in. She just called me out. She said her sister had sent me a Tet gift, including Australian chocolate for me. I happily accepted it, but I didn't take the lucky money because my mother said she didn't have a job, and the relatives on the other side didn't send much money, so don't accept it from others. I took the candy but also gave it to the neighbor's boy instead of eating it. And I don't know if it's a coincidence because after eating chocolate, my neighbor T had a fever for 5 days. It wasn't until the day I got in the car to go back to Sigan that I saw him wearing a coat and a scarf, his face haggard, greeting him home. Sigan goes to school. Since returning to the lad for Tet, my mother's health has deteriorated a bit. She often has back pain and joint pain. Dad told me to go home and take my mother to the doctor. Then my sister also told me to send someone to buy medicine abroad for my mother to take, but mother insisted. Mom told Mrs. Lena that someone sent medicine to her from Australia, so she applied it and felt better. Feel much better. Whenever I call my mother, she always says it's better, but lately she rarely goes out to play sports with the girls at school because of her joint pain. Whenever I apply medicine from her grandmother, it helps, but when I stop applying it, I stay home in pain. During the summer, I went back to the lab to visit my mother and found it strange because she came over to visit more often. My mother was more irritable and ate very little. I'm worried about my mother's health, so I always tell her, tomorrow, when you go to Sigan, I have to eat properly. If I keep like this, how can I be healthy? Mom hummed and then mentioned Mrs. Lone again. She said that every day she was busy teaching all morning and afternoon. She sent the kitchen key to Mrs. Lone to cook and then came back to have lunch so she could go to work in the afternoon for convenience. At night, my mother often closes the bedroom door to watch TV. One day I came in and saw my mother take out a jar of sunscreen and apply it. She said the jar was out of cream. She gave Mrs. Lone some medicine for joint pain and she took it and applied it, and the pain was much better. Mrs. Lone never gave the whole tube of medicine to my mother, but only took the empty box and poured it in, so I didn't think much of it, because the medicine had an oily smell and was quite hot, probably good for my joints. Sometimes I think that neighbors often come to visit, and my mother is happy to be alone, so I don't interfere, although I see that Mrs. Lone's interference has been unusually frequent lately. Besides the fact that her knees often hurt, my mother's health compared to people at that age, I saw that she was not weak until more than a year ago. She had pain in her abdomen. It was so painful that she had to call an ambulance to be taken to the hospital. I was studying but had to quit and go home to take care of my mother. The doctor said that my mother had acute cholecystitis and had to be treated for 1 week at the hospital and might need surgery. But after 3 days of medicine, my mother felt better and the doctor said there was no need for surgery because her health condition was already very good. While my mother was in the hospital, many of her colleagues and aunts came to visit. She was ill. Very caring. My mother was in the hospital, so I had to cook at home and bring it up for her to eat and take her medicine. The first day I went into the kitchen to cook lunch for my mother, and saw that the stairs down to the kitchen had a black carpet. It was strange that the carpet was not placed at the top or bottom of the stairs, but was placed right in the middle, at the stairs. I thought maybe the old house leaked and was dirty, so my mother left it there to absorb the water. But when I asked, my mother said she told me that the carpet should be placed on this step because it is slippery and dangerous to walk on. In the early days, when my mother was still in a lot of pain, I slept in the hospital to take care of her. When my father returned from work in Sigan, he replaced me at the hospital. When I slept at home alone, I had the same dream 3 nights in a row. It's been a while so I don't remember the exact details, but I saw a young girl with a harsh accent. I couldn't see her face clearly but she seemed very familiar. She said, "Don't let it in, don't let it in," she said, standing at the top of the stairs leading to the kitchen, glaring at the black carpet and pointing. That night it happened 2 to 3 times like that and I started to have a bad feeling about Miss Lone. The day my mother returned home from the hospital, Miss Lone happily ran over to the house to ask about her condition. She sat next to my mother and rubbed her hands. "Honey makes me feel extremely uncomfortable." Suddenly there was a car sound in front of the house. My mother told me to run out to see who was calling at the door. Stepping out of the house, I noticed a car parked in front of the door, 2 old grandparents and a young couple sitting in the front seat. The old grandparents got out of the car and smiled to greet me. Before I realized it, they were patting my head and saying, "These days you're so big, I used to carry you in my arms when I was still a baby." Probably relatives came to visit, but I don't have anyone in my family in the central region. The young couple walked down after. The husband looked successful, and the wife looked quite pretty and agile. Inviting them into the house for a drink, my mother ran down, shaking hands happily. She said this was Mr. Long and his wife. When I was young, they used to take care of me. The young couple bowed to my mother. The girl was Mr. Long's daughter, and the other was the newlywed husband. The whole family went on a trip and visited my house. I had no impression of them except the daughter's voice. I was even a little scared because it was exactly the voice of the person I dreamed about. It was unmistakable, it was the voice of a person. But this woman looked taller than the person I saw in my dream. After the story between my mother and the others, I learned. This girl's name is Tran, her family is in Fuyen, she is Dao's younger sister, who used to stay at my house when she was a student. Turning to the story about Miss Dao. Miss Dao's family used to have difficulties. When she passed university, Mr. Long took her around the Dalat University area to find a boarding house and my mother helped her. Miss Dao is very obedient and diligent. Besides studying, she also helps my mother with housework in her free time. My whole family loves Miss Dao so much that she doesn't even take money for accommodation. In 1994, my house was built with 2 more floors, by which time I was old enough to be aware of everything around me. In my impression, Miss Dao was very good. One time she took my 2 sisters to school when her parents were busy with work. She often jokes around and pampers me very much. When my house was completed, the whole family moved to the upper floor, and the lower floor planned to accommodate more students. At that time, Miss Dow was alone downstairs. That night, the lab was cold, rainy and windy, and something bad happened. Miss Dow came home late from her part-time job and slipped and fell down the stairs. Only in the morning did my whole family discover that she had died, perhaps because she had lost a lot of blood, but no one had time to detect it. My family loves her very much, it's like a loss in the family. When the house was small, we were together like 3 sisters. When the house was built, she was separated from Dow downstairs. When this happened, I was still angry. Her parents built the house higher, causing Miss Dow's death. But time passed and everything was fine. Now Miss Dow's parents came to visit and introduced Miss Tran and her newlywed husband. It had been so long that no one mentioned Miss Dow. I was the only one left thinking, for a moment, then startled again. When did Mrs. Lone, who had been sitting and chatting with her mother, come back and now sit and chat with her? Since when did you come back? The door was only open to welcome people in, but no one came out. For the past 3 days, Mr. Long's family and Miss Tran and her husband have stayed at my house and not at the hotel because the house is big and during the tourist season it is very difficult to find accommodation. Mrs. Lone's house has guests and she no longer comes over. And I started to wonder about the girl in my dream a few days ago, maybe it was Miss Dow. You're trying to tell me something. That day I decided to go down to the kitchen and take the carpet Mrs. Lone gave me to throw in the trash. Horrifyingly, the stairs underneath the carpet were full of black stains, covered like fish scales, looking very disgusting. I used soap to rub it over and over again, but the marks never disappeared. I had to use another towel to cover them. Because looking at that strange patchy stain, everyone who sees it must shudder. On the last day that Mr. Long was at my house, my mother told the whole family to make a meal to see him off tomorrow. 3 days of traveling must have been tiring. You guys stayed home with Tran and my family to cook a farewell meal. Mother and aunt worked hard in the kitchen. My uncle, my father and Tran's brother-in-law were upstairs watching TV and talking. After cooking, my mother called me to come down and bring the rice. When I came down, I saw Miss Tran cleaning the stairs. She said she saw stains and was ready to clean them, and strangely, Miss Tran had already cleaned the black stains that I tried to come to the other day. It's impossible to scrub clean. When he went down to the kitchen, he saw Mr. Long's wife fussing. He said that the mirror in the kitchen was used by Miss Dow in the past, and it reminded him of his late daughter. The night Uncle Long returned, I drew into the burning fire. Then she went into the kitchen and put up the mirror. After finishing work, the girl patted my head and went into the house, walked to the foot of the stairs and lay down. I woke up and knew for sure that the girl in my dream was Miss Dow. She was trying to tell me. Instead of feeling scared like the previous times, that night I eagerly waited until morning and would do what I saw in my dream. Early in the morning, I went to the kitchen and set up the mirror that was lying face up. Then go to the garden to clean up fallen leaves. Gathered it in a corner and burned it. Then I didn't forget to go back to the trash and take Miss Lone's carpet and throw it into the fire. The burnt carpet smelled horribly, like a dead mouse. From that day on, the whole family's spirits improved. The bottle of joint medicine her grandmother had given her was gone. Instead, my mother took the joint medicine my sister bought. My mother no longer has knee pain and exercises regularly early in the morning. Mrs. Lone never came to visit again. Mother said that the day Mr. Long came, Mrs. Lone came up to greet her mother and pack her things to prepare to settle in Australia. Strange things or illnesses no longer appear in my house. My father returned to the lat for the holidays 4 days ago and just called me to tell the story. The other day, 2 young men came to Mrs. Lone's house. They were Mrs. Lone's sister's children. They brought fruit to burn incense. Seeing that, my mother also came over to ask about the matter because she had not seen news of Mrs. Lone for a long time. The 2 of them said that in the past, they often came back to Vietnam to visit their aunt, but after their aunt died in an accident, this was the first time they returned to Vietnam. Miss Lone had an accident and passed away in 2007, but in the last 3 years, neighbors still saw the house lights on, and Miss Lone walked around the neighborhood asking about her. Miss Lone's ghost was not welcomed by anyone, except my mother, so she often came to the house. Perhaps she was not a good ghost, so she caused many strange and sick things in my house. Fortunately, Miss Dow helped. If not, we don't know what other disasters will happen. Because the story is completely true, please listen to it. If you don't believe it, don't talk about the dead people, and this is the end of the story. It's good for everyone to hear the story. I would like 1 like and 1 subscriber. Hope everyone has fun listening to the story. See you in the next videos. Goodbye.